My name's Andy Cathrow, and I'm responsible for our managed services here at Red Hat. A few things about me. I think the key technical factors: Fedora, always Fedora, Bash, Python, unashamedly Vim, and slightly ashamed of Chrome, but I'll get back to Firefox one day. So there's two Fedoras underneath my biopic there. That's because I'm what's called a boomerang. So 9 years at Red Hat, 5 years out, and back for just less than a year. Based out of San Antonio, if you can't tell from my accent. So I want to talk today about managed services, which is obviously something you don't associate with Red Hat. So I'll explain a bit about why and how we've been doing that. And I'll talk about some of our products. So I've got a handful of slides, but I'll spend more time on a demo, so don't worry about that. So as I mentioned, we're not known to be a managed services company. But actually, we've been doing a managed Kubernetes service since back in 2015. I think only Google and Red Hat can actually make that claim. And it's been evolving over time. So we had early days of OpenShift with Kubernetes, through the OCP platform, 3, now on to 4, with a number of joint services with partners such as IBM, Microsoft, and more recently AWS. And we'll talk about that more in a few more slides. So why managed services? So I think there's really two reasons from my point of view. The first one is it helps us deliver a better product to our customers. So there's this like virtuous cycle. If we are customer zero, we're getting the product right up the development line, up the pipeline. We're not just testing it, going through use cases, but we're deploying, managing, and maintaining it. It's not just one short-lived test. It's something that's up 24/7, 365. We get to learn a lot. So, we get to learn through that deployment. We get to, I'm told to say, drink our own champagne, not dog food. But I think some days it could be either, and that's kind of really the point, right? So we find a problem, we fix it early. The goal being that when we give you that software, you as our customers or the community, then the software is in better shape. So the second reason for a managed service is to help you, our customers, deliver a better service to your users. So if we can take some of the work off your shoulders, if you don't have to do operations 24/7, you can do innovation 9/5. So delivering a managed service lets you consume more OpenShift, and it's not just charitable, right? The more successful you are, the more you deploy, the more you pay us, so everybody's happy. So in terms of these managed services, so I think one of the great things about OpenShift is the choice that you get, right? So you decide where you want to run, whether it's on-prem, whether it's on IBM, Azure, Google Cloud, AWS, or probably a bit of all of these, right? Certainly the majority of folks that I talk to are hybrid with on-prem and some public cloud. The beauty is that no matter where you run OpenShift, it's the same version of Kubernetes with the same stack, with the same lifecycle, with the same tooling. So you get consistency. Through each one of these clouds, you will not find the same version of Kubernetes. It's going to be a different version, different lifecycle, different release date. And that's before you think about the stack on top of Kubernetes. Like everything you would put, whether it's a platform native monitoring or a Prometheus and a Grafana, everything in that stack will be different. So we can give you consistency, and you choose where you run. And you can also choose who's going to manage that. Do you manage it yourself, or do we manage it for you to take away some of that workload? In terms of kind of the total cost of ownership of these clouds, and I won't get into too much of the financials, other than to say that the cheapest way to run OpenShift by far on a public cloud is our managed services, even more so than OCP. But what we find is by delivering this, and we don't charge for managed service, right? We charge for an OpenShift subscription or a managed OpenShift subscription, and management is part of that. So the cost that you will be spending on the extra stack that you may have for logging, management, service mesh, etc., that's part of our subscription. But more importantly, operationally, the extra SREs you would hire for the platform, the folks who take the calls at 3 a.m. when something breaks, who get up at Saturday at 2 a.m. for an upgrade, that's part of the service. And again, it's not an extra line item that you would pay, it's just a core part of the service. So again, even cheaper running a managed OpenShift on, let's say, AWS than you procuring OCP and managing it yourself. So everyone's got a managed service, right? Everyone out there's got some story about management. We want to really differentiate what we mean from managed, right? It's not a managed control plane, it's a managed stack, right? So the way that I answer this question for a customer about how it's different is if some of your nodes go down at 2 o'clock in the night, right? Critical workloads are stopped, who gets the call, right? So with us, we've set up the monitoring, we get the alert, we handle that mitigation. The goal should be that when you get up in the morning, the next morning, you could read your cluster log and see there was a mitigated issue, but you shouldn't be worrying about that. Right? That work is handled by us. And in a few more minutes after the slides, I'll show some of the RACI, and showing you RACI sounds really boring. I promise it's going to be interesting, just to show the difference in what we do and the work we can take off your shoulders. So really quickly, if I talk through the services that we have, so OpenShift Dedicated, or OSD, is, I guess, our most long-running managed service. So think of this as a fully managed OCP installation, either on Google Cloud or AWS. So managed by us, your choice of region, the nodes that you want, the self-service provision of the cluster. You control the things like the VPCs, the Direct Connect, you're empowered to do that. We control the infrastructure. Everything from patching, management, mitigation is part of the service, and we'll demo that shortly. And then next we have ARO, or Azure Red Hat Openshift. So it's a jointly engineered, jointly operated and supported platform. So you go into the Azure console or the AZ command line and you want to deploy a cluster, just do that, build to your Azure build natively, supported jointly by Red Hat and Microsoft. So same thing in the console as an AKS would be, just effectively a native service. It's just jointly operated by ourselves and Microsoft. Okay, so one of the great things is if you want a cluster, you want to deploy OCP, and you've got some quick testing to do. What does 4.6 look like? What does it look like to go from 4.4 to 4.5? Go on the console or go on the command line, deploy a cluster. You've got a cluster in a few minutes. You tear it down, right? And so you don't have to have this investment where you call sales, do a traditional kind of Red Hat selling motion. It's just nimble, right? You just consumption on demand, tear it down. So for the cost of the latter, you've kind of deployed the cluster for an hour, you've got a fitting for the service, throw it down. Right? So it gives you more agility in your deployments, just as you're used to with other cloud services. Now, what is new is a service that we announced jointly with AWS a few months ago. It's in a preview now, and if you want to email me, aic@redhat.com. Happy to see more folks on the preview, and we'll talk more as we get into KubeCon and reInvent. So this is a very similar in scope. So we have a native service on AWS. You're going to be able to go into the AWS console. You're going to define Red Hat OpenShift Service next to all the other container services on the console page, and it's going to give you again on-demand consumption of OpenShift. So flexible billing, you can do pre-commit for a year, you can do hourly consumption, again, as you would with any other cloud service. Again, jointly developed, managed, and operated by Red Hat and AWS. Again, the biggest things we hear from customers is we want to have a simplicity of our consumption, not two vendors, not two bills, so a single bill. This joint support and a better foundation of integration by having Red Hat not just competing with AWS, but now cooperating with customers. Right, so customers now have a choice. Maybe for some use cases, a Fargate and EKS is right. For other use cases, an OpenShift. And where we're seeing a lot of interest is customers who have on-prem OCP, they want to move to the cloud. And rather than changing from OpenShift to another Kubernetes and from private to public, they can take their environment from on-prem, deploy it on a public cloud, and get that consistent operational experience, tooling experience, and user interface. So as I mentioned, user experience from when we go from private preview to GA, sitting right next to the rest of the Kubernetes service in the console, in the console landing page. But most of the time you're going to spend is looking at this, because let's be honest, the most popular UI for anything in the cloud today is actually the CLI. So we're going to concentrate some of the time on the demo on the CLI. So with that, I'm going to end the slides. I've got 4 or 5 more I can always come back to, which sounds like a threat, but I think we'll spend better time going through a demo. So I'm going to start on this UI, and this is OCM, or OpenShift Cluster Manager. So if you go to cloud@redhat.com, get an account, you click through here. What I'm seeing here now is this filter on some clusters called ROSA, but I'll start there. This is our UI where I can see the clusters that I have in my environment. What I'm going to do now is have a quick look at a couple of the ROSA clusters. Then I'll flip over to the command line and play a bit there. So I've got a demo cluster up and running here now. So this is not the OpenShift console. If you're used to OpenShift, then you'll recognize this console. You think of the OCM console as where you do provisioning from, where I would say, I want the cluster. This is what I want the cluster to look like. So the kind of things that I can do within OCM. So I can do provisioning of clusters, which I'll show you here in a second, and then on the command line. But I can do some basic management of my cluster. So for example, here I'm seeing that I've got an update available. So I'm running an OpenShift 4.5.11. I want to do an upgrade. So the upgrades are something that we will handle for you. Now you could say that I'm on a weekly cadence and always the latest at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Or more likely for an enterprise, you would pick a version you want to upgrade to, you would schedule when you want that to be upgraded, and then we would kick in and we would do that work. So I would schedule that upgrade through this UI, or I set up my maintenance windows, and we would do that for you. Other kind of things I would see here outside of provisioning, going through any alerts to arrays, access controls, whether I'm configuring identity providers, granting administrator access, adding more load balancers, making my cluster private. For example, this is publicly accessible on the internet, so I might want to make that one private. Machine pools, where I want to add more nodes, more pools of work nodes to the system. And then support, where I can specify who gets the contacts for this cluster and any support cases that come in. So if there's any cases, whether you created them or we created them, you will see those in the OCM UI. So let me go back and go to the command line, which is kind of more where I'd expect most users to live. Right? Typically, you provision a cluster once, right? And the only time you'd really end up going into OCM would be if I wanted to schedule an upgrade or change my upgrade windows. So let me start with ROSA, which is a command line tool for our joint service with AWS. Okay, so ROSA, who am I? So ROSA's logged into both OCM, but also obviously pulling in your credentials from AWS. What I'm going to do to start off with is just look what I have on the system. So I've got a couple of clusters that I've created. I'm just going to get rid of one just while we're talking, and I'm going to provision another one as well. So let me just delete the cluster. So what can I do? If I wanted to do a creation, I'm going to start off with, delete. Let's decide where I want to deploy it. So in terms of where we supported it, so we support in all the standard regions. So when the regions come online, if OCP supports it, we'll support it within our managed services. So let me say now that I want to create a cluster. So create a cluster. I'm going to put it into interactive mode a little bit easier. So give the cluster a name. I do want it to be multi-AZ or single AZ. I will keep my build down by making it single availability zone. Pick a region I want to deploy it. Pick a version of OpenShift that I want to deploy. By the way, in the background, you've probably seen this cluster realizing it's being uninstalled and it's now showing the logs as it goes. So pick a release that I want to install. The kind of instances as a base node type. I can add more, and we'll see it in a second. If I've got particular side ranges I need for my service. So that's going to kick off now. An OpenShift install will take, on a good day, about 20 minutes. Usually it's about 30 to 35 minutes, given everything else it's putting in place with all the added services we lay on top. So that cluster should now be going through the installation process. Let's go back, let's look at the cluster that I have today. So let's have a look at the demo cluster here. So just tell me a bit about the cluster, where it's installed, how to get into the console, rough topology. So I've got 5 compute nodes there. So I can actually look at, we've got a notion of machine pools. So here I've got just a single machine pool with M5X large. If I wanted to go and then add another set of worker nodes, so I could say create machine pool for which cluster I want. Then it will ask me the name of the pool, how many instance types, etc. I'm going to exit out because I'm knocking out my budget right now. Okay, so the goal is that all the basic creation, managing the cluster I can do from the UI, from an API, as well as from the CLI. So other little things I might want to do, I've just done over the cluster or created a cluster, so I'm going to get to download on my OpenShift client tool, so OC, which is kubectl plus some added commands. And other things I could do here, I could grant rights to users. I could look at logs. So if I wanted to now look at the install log for the cluster or the other log I was working on, let's have a quick look. You probably noticed me typing OA there, Moro. We recently renamed it from Managed OpenShift on AWS to this ROSA, so I am still typing the wrong name occasionally. So ROSA.
Real quick, while you're doing that, how are you handling authentication with the AWS resources? Did you say that it was syncing with IAM?
Yes, so there's 2 kind of connections going on. One is to OCM for command and control, but after that is all IAM. So we have a service called Hive, and Hive is kind of our backend management plane, and that will be it's going to use the local credentials to create basically the users and roles that we need for the install. So yeah, it's leveraging IAM, but we have the command and control service that we have is using OCM. So OCM is in place because it's multi-cloud. I could do the same thing on Google, for example, as I could on ROSA here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
So let's go through. I can dig into a bit more, but I want to quickly talk about the other services, and we can come back to look at this one running. But basic things like describe the cluster C. One of the interesting ones, which maybe doesn't sound quite so interesting right now, but if you've done enough installations, it is. We have this verify command. And the idea is that a lot of the times when we are working on new services and new users, we may find there's issues with kind of permissions. So one of the things that we'll do as part of the install, and actually we do a dry run before the install that will actually block, is we can actually go back and verify you've got enough quota for all the services, whether it's ELBs, EC2, etc., and likewise for permissions to make sure that we don't want to start anything we can't finish. So obviously my account is set up correctly. If it wasn't, it would show you where you have not enough quota, so I don't get half of a cluster, and where you have any permissions issues with instructions on how to fix those. So that's the ROSA tool. There is no UI today in AWS console. That's work in progress. We'll talk more about the timing for that as we get into reInvent. On the Azure side, so I'm now in the Azure Portal, and I've got a number of clusters kind of set up here already. We'll look at those, and then we'll flip to the command line. So OpenShift, or ARO for this service, Azure Red Hat OpenShift, is a native service in the console. You'll find it with other services. I've got 3 clusters installed here now. So you can look at the cluster, look at be deployed, link off to get into the console, tagging changes, etc. But again, most of the time that you spend using this will not be spent on the UI. It's going to be spent on the console. So for AWS, I mentioned that we have a separate command line to ROSA, similar, I guess, to how EKS Cathrow is separate, it's not an AWS. With Azure, we're actually integrated into the AZ command line. So if you're using the AZ tools, there's a subcommand for ARO. So I can do AZ ARO list, give me a table, get a list of the clusters that are available to me in resource groups I have access to. So I wanted to go in and get details on a cluster. Rather good name for a cluster, calling it cluster. So whether it's creating a cluster, whether it's quickly, I guess this would be better. Whether we're creating a cluster, deleting a cluster, managing it, scaling it, we can do all these operations through AZ. We don't currently have OCM plumbed into ARO, but that's something that we're working on right now.
Andy, quick question. I was just wondering, when talking about ROSA, for example, or AWS, and driving it via the command line, do you already have the profile set up, i.e. which accounts and which VPCs to deploy into? All of these things are already set up beforehand?
It's a good question. So in terms of accounts, it's going to use the account that I was in. You can specify a different account, but it's going to use your local AWS credentials, and it will create the roles for that. If I was, in terms of the VPCs, we can either create a VPC or you can specify an existing VPC. We like the idea of being in a sub-account with a separate VPC, so we get good kind of good resource boundary. But you can install into an account with anything else in it, and you could use an existing VPC. So it just depends. I mean, for a demo, it's a have a look cleaner for me just to create the VPC rather than specify one, but you could specify as well as creating a new VPC.
One other quick question is that, all of these instances that are being deployed from a cost perspective, it will still automatically seamlessly take advantage of saving plans or reserve instances and all that?
Yes, a good question. So it will use the OIs or whatever, it be based on what you've got in your account. So whether it's if it's on the ROSA service, whether if you've done ROSA on demand with those or ROSA with a 1-year commit, we actually have 3-year as well. You can get reserved instances, same with what we use under the covers. The one thing that we don't have today that we'll have early in January is spot instances. We don't have that one right now. We've got it in OpenShift. We just haven't plumbed it into the CLI yet. So we're adding that as part of the machine pools. So that's going to be an attribute of the machine pool.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so I mentioned RACI, and you all had the cameras off, so I'm sure you weren't all frowning when I said RACI. One thing we see is like a differentiator, and it's a kind of a good kind of document to work through, and I promise I won't present it here now, is what we do. Right? Our goal is to empower our customers to deliver their applications better and faster with less operational burden. To do that, there's a lot of work that we do. So the things that we don't touch, we don't touch your data, your applications, we don't develop. Everything else is either managed by Red Hat or we have a shared responsibility matrix. So a good example about what could be shared and why, I'm responsible for all the nodes. I'm responsible for the masters, but I'm not responsible for what version you run. I would love you to be on the latest version the day of the release. You probably wouldn't like that. You probably want to spend some time doing testing and validation. So that would be an example of something that you're responsible for. In terms of capacity, I would keep you up and running, but if you want to set criteria, maximum levels, then that's your choice. But typically, anything we can offload for you, we will offload for you. And we cover, again, the links in the presentation, but, things that we don't do, we'll talk about how we help. Right? So if there's something that that we do directly, we'll outline it. Something that we don't do, we'll say, how we will help you with your monitoring. For example, providing user workload monitoring or Prometheus stacks, etc. So again, race is not the sexiest topic in the world, but I think what's interesting from my point of view is what we empower the customer to do by taking that work away. So we see that as a big differentiator to other Kubernetes services because we're not a managed control plane, we're a managed stack, which is, I think, a significant cost saver for most enterprises.